Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 17, where I'll be drinking an iced coffee made with Atlas Coffee Club coffee, and we're going to be talking about the importance of intuition in a professional setting. We're going to talk about what intuition is, where it comes from, and why it's an underrated yet really critical skill that makes a huge difference. So with that said, let's get started. I remember this one time when I was writing a midterm and I finished the midterm, I reviewed and I'm ready to submit. And just before I submit, I realized that everybody around me, they're still seated. And then I think, well, is it possible for me to, find this exam so easy that I finished it so quickly and everybody else is still seated? So I second guess myself and I go back to my seat, and despite having a feeling that, all my answers are correct, I go back and I redo one of my answers. And let's just say that I wish I didn't do that. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, right? Like, have you ever been in a situation where you had to make a decision and instead of trusting your gut feeling, what you do is you go with the decision that had the most logical explanation? This actually happens more often than we realize, and it has a lot to do with how we connect or disconnect to our intuition. So, to describe what intuition is, imagine that you're in a room full of people, and for no specific reason, you feel drawn to one specific person, or perhaps you even feel repelled by another person. And you don't exactly have like a rational explanation for it, but you know that that's just it. And that's exactly what intuition is. It's an inner knowing despite having any logical reasoning or any external cues. And as useless as many people believe intuition to be, a study done by Harvard Business Review actually shows that 85% of CEOs use intuition when making decisions. Not just intuition, because the best decisions are actually made with a combination of intuition and logic, but they do use intuition when making decisions. Okay, so now we know what intuition is, but where does it actually come from? Is it just some sort of a feeling, or is there something deeper? For example, how do birds know when and where to migrate? Or how does your pet dog know to bark at some people versus not at others? These are all actually intuitive abilities, and intuition is actually an evolutionary trait. From a neuroscience perspective, there was a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio who actually theorized that we use somatic markers such as heart rates or hormone levels to translate our subconscious emotions into instinctual responses. So intuition is legit. So the question really boils down to, why are so many people disconnected from their intuition and struggling to harness its power? This actually has a lot to do with societal programming. Media, consumerism, and a bunch of societal norms actually condition us to seek validation and ignore inner voice. Think about the number of times you were told that you need some sort of a degree or some sort of a certification in order to succeed. Now, imagine telling a bird that it needs a certification in order to fly, something it does naturally. How bizarre, am I right? Similarly, us humans are actually fed information in order to get us to doubt our natural instincts and our natural skills. And when I talk about natural skills, I'm not talking about things like technical skills, because those aren't actually very natural. Things like engineering, learning some sort of software and things like that, those all require certifications, right? But soft skills, those are the more instinctual skills. Certifications for skills like communication, leadership, or even sales, those are the ones that exploit our insecurities, because these are the skills that can actually be developed without any sort of external validation. Think about it. The highlight of sales is the ability to understand a consumer, which heavily relies on intuition and the ability to manipulate, right, to some sort of an extent. So no matter what type of a certification you have and how much knowledge you're given with regards to sales, if you're not tapped into your intuition and you don't have the ability to manipulate, you're not going to be a great salesperson, no matter what. And same thing with leadership, right? You have to really be able to understand the people you're working with and understand subliminal cues. And no matter how many instructional manuals you're given and how many certifications you're given on this, it's only your intuition that's the driving force that'll allow you to be a successful leader. And the same exact thing with communication. When people tell you that you're unable to communicate, what happens is that they're actually lowering your confidence. And when your confidence is lowered, that's when you actually fall into the trap into believing that there's something wrong with your communication, and that it's something that you are unable to navigate on your own. And to be completely honest, these sources of validation are not only disempowering or disconnecting people from their intuition, but they're actually a disservice to the workforce. Why? Because when people get these certifications, in essence, what they're actually getting are just a bunch of instruction manuals which prevent them from thinking without them. Like, what would they have without them? If another situation or a novel situation arises, how are they going to navigate it? Well, they wouldn't know, right? Because they wouldn't have an instruction manual for that. So if there's one thing that actually needs to be taught or brought back to light, it's how to reconnect to intuition. Because all of the skills that I highlighted above are all highly intuitive. Now that we know why intuition is so important, how does intuition actually show up in our lives? It can be in the form of feelings, dreams, visions, and even quick fleeting thoughts. Here's actually a time that intuition showed up in my life and saved me from making a misaligned decision. So, a while back, I was considering working with a group of investors for my podcast, and on the surface, it seemed like an amazing opportunity. But as time passed and I continued to interact with them, I actually had a different feeling about working with them. I felt like I needed to walk away from this opportunity. Not only that, actually, but I even had visions of what was happening behind the scenes. And luckily, after a while, I actually decided to trust my intuition, and I found out that those investors weren't actually aligned with my mission. They were quite self-serving and mercenary individuals. But luckily, because of my intuition, it saved me from making a bad decision. And the reason I was able to tell that it was my intuition versus fear or anything like that was because the visions and the feelings, they were quite quick. They weren't persistent and they weren't connected to some sort of a past narrative or experience that I had. So that's something to also keep in mind. You have to be able to realize that sometimes fear may confuse itself for intuition, but you can still tell the difference. Now you might be wondering, well, how do I even start tuning into my intuition? Well, don't worry, I've got you covered. Number one, you could start meditating. Because when you quiet the chatter in your mind, what you're doing is you're actually leaving space for your intuition to be able to speak to you. Number two, you can actually play a guessing game with a friend where person A chooses a number between 1 to 10 and person B has to guess the number. And the trick to this game is that the first thought that you have in your head is probably the correct thought because that thought occurs before you actually start consciously thinking, if that makes sense. And number three, try to have a little bit more body awareness. Try to recognize how you feel around certain people versus others, and try to keep note of the patterns. So by now, we've even explored some strategies to help you cultivate more intuition, right? But how can all of this make a difference in your life starting today? So remember at the beginning where I shared a story of how I regretted not following my intuition? If there's one thing that I learned from that story, it's that intuition is like a quiet guide. It doesn't shout, but it's actually always there to guide you. So here's my challenge to you. Think about a recent decision that you made. Was there a moment where your gut told you something but you didn't listen? What would have happened if you had listened to your gut? So with that said, I think it's very intuitive that we've reached the end of this episode. So until next time, folks.
This program is meant for entertainment purposes only. It is not meant to replace any educational programs or represent a professional coaching program. All examples provided by the author and speaker are purely anecdotal and are not meant to represent any institutions or companies in affiliation with the creator.